Good day, everybody. Zack here with RevZilla, and welcome to another episode of Daily Rider. Our guest today is the KTM 1390 Super Duke R Evo. That is a big old liquid-cooled V-twin stuffed into a fairly bare-bones chassis, sprinkled with just about every electronic feature you can get in 2024. It is very high performance. It is very orange. It is very much supposed to be a flagship statement motorcycle. That being said, its predecessor, the 1290 Super Duke, always pulled off a neat trick whereby it was extremely fast and exhilarating, but also pretty nice and pleasant to use on a daily basis. So our mission today is to determine whether the 1390 has that appropriate balance of Super and Duke. Buckle up, everybody. We got a lot to talk about. Let's go. Alrighty, before we get going here today, a quick reminder that this episode of Daily Rider is brought to you by RevZilla. Not just the YouTube channel that you're watching, but also an online marketplace with parts and accessories for motorcycles and people who love them. A little bit of every dollar you spend at RevZilla.com goes toward making Daily Rider and other videos like it on the RevZilla YouTube channel. So the next time you need a new helmet, jacket, saddlebags, tires, whatever the case may be, we hope you'll keep us in mind. In the meantime, thanks very much for watching. Alrighty, 1390 Super Duke R Evo. Let's start at the engine, shall we? This is a 75-degree V-twin. It is 1,350 cc's, that's 1350, up from a 1301 in the 1290 Super Duke, via a little bit of bore. I think 110 millimeter bores instead of 108, maybe. Same stroke. So foundationally, the engine basically just get a little bit more bore, slightly more displacement. Not as much as the 100 cc's you would suggest from the name of the bike. But technologically, the engine makes a whole bunch of steps forward. It's a lot more complicated, both mechanically and electronically, which we'll talk about over the course of the ride to some extent. The big thing is variable valve timing, which acts on the intake cam only and changes the valve timing as the RPMs go up, which is pretty typical for any bike with variable valve actuation. Honda VFRs, Ducati Multistradas, Harley Pan Americas, Suzuki GSXR 1000s. These bikes all have varying systems to accomplish kind of the same thing, which is to have good torque down low and good power up top by changing the cam timing as the revs go up. Pretty neat. The engine is also a stressed member of the chassis, which is why these frame spars kind of reach down part way and it doesn't connect with a classic cradle that you might see on an old motorcycle. The subframe is not steel. I think it's like a combination of cast aluminum and composite materials or something like that to try to keep the thing light instead of the trellis steel subframe that the old original sort of 1290 Super Duke had. On the suspension front, you got a big old WP fork here, which is electronically controlled for damping. We'll talk about some of the settings that the bike has. And same thing with the shock. It is a WP shock and has a whole bunch of electronic adjustability, which is pretty darned fancy. While we're at the back of the bike, we can check out the single-sided swing arm, which I always think looks pretty rad, and a fairly sleek muffler considering the size of the engine. But if you look underneath, of course, you'll see this big old bread box and whatnot under here, all this plumbing to deal with emissions regulations and that kind of thing, and also just these headers that are like the size of a diesel truck. They're absolutely massive. Brembo calipers up front, 320 millimeter discs, I think. Really high-spec braking hardware, and it's high spec in general, right? It's a $20,000 bike, more than that, which I think I failed to mention in the intro, but it's expensive and you'd expect this stuff to be nice, and it is. What else we got here? Yeah, this headlight assembly, which is like, when you step back from the bike and you look at it, everyone's got their own opinion of what it looks like. There's lots of people that make fun of how angular and strange and sci-fi and alien and bizarre the bike looks, and that's fair. You can have your opinion of it, whatever you want, I don't care. I just think as a piece of engineering, it's kind of a neat assembly. It's just so tidy and small. I mean, it's just these two little wings of plastic with a sort of like center rail holding the LEDs. You can see the heat sinks for the LEDs are exposed, and yeah, it's sort of flanked by this running light, but the whole thing is just like, I don't know, it just like bolt off pretty easily. It's all very simple, and I appreciate how kind of raw the aesthetic of the bike is, whether you like it or not. Okie doke, I think we're ready. This little lock button here, press that sucker, and this 5-inch TFT will come to life with a little 30 years of Duke badge thingy. And the bike will tell you that the side stands down, which is something I already knew. So we can get rid of that and then fire this baby up. What do you think? That sound like a lot of horsepower on tap? Well, it's just getting warmed up, you know. So we'll give it a minute, I suppose. There we go. This is the 1390 Super Duke R Evo Daily Rider kicking off. Let's ride to work. Yeah, I know about the side stand. Holy Moses. Right. Off we go. Okie doke. A few specs to get out of the way early on here. Let's start with weight. 469 pounds on the Daily Rider scales with a full 4.6 gallons of gas. The seat height is 32.8 inches, which feels pretty tall. Not unreasonably so, but at 6'2", it's sort of like easy for me to flat foot, but the bike does not feel low or short. As far as pricing goes, it's going to be $21,500 for a base Super Duke, and then in typical KTM fashion, there are packs to add to get upgrades for the suspension, the electronics, and what else? Maybe that's it. Anyway, we'll talk more about actual price of this bike a little bit later on, but 21.5 is the base, and KTM claims 190 horsepower at 10,000 RPM and 107 foot-pounds of torque at 8,000 RPM. It is a monstrously powerful engine, especially considering the bike weighs 470 pounds. As for what it feels like to sit on, I said the seat feels fairly tall, and to me that's the biggest difference that I noticed between this bike and the old 1290 Super Duke. Not that I feel like it's necessary to make a lot of comparisons to the old bike, but it is an evolution, of course, and the seat feels fairly high and fairly flat, but also surprisingly cushy considering the sort of look of the bike. Actually, the feel of it is pretty comfy. And then the handlebar is fairly low and narrow. You feel like you have a lot of body weight over the front of the bike, and the foot pegs feel sort of appropriately high, not ultra sporty, but definitely high enough that they feel like they're not going to drag on a racetrack, which I can confirm the street tires anyway, they did not. So overall, it's a surprisingly comfortable bike. I think based on the Instagram feedback that I got, it seems like some people were really expecting it to be just really, really kind of like blunt and uncompromising, you know, like too raw to ever be comfortable, but it's not that at all. It's definitely a little bit aggressive and a little bit sporty, but there's plenty of comfort and relaxation mixed into the ergonomics, which I really appreciate. It's a really nice blend. So let's experiment with 107 foot-pounds of torque, shall we? Or at least some of it. So I'm going 30 miles an hour in third gear. I'm going to put on my blinker, check my left lane, and then open the throttle. And yeah, it is incredibly strong. And that was just sort of the bottom of the revs, not even up where the bike makes a lot of power, but just sort of the stump pulling torque that this engine has. It's really, really satisfying. And I think I was able to forget in the many years that I have spent not riding a 1290 Super Duke before I got on the 1390, just how kind of like immense and powerful it feels. It's different. Like a Ducati Street Fighter V4 has lots of torque, yes. An Aprilia Tuono V4 has lots of torque, yes. Even a BMW S1000 Single R, or a Kawasaki Z1000, or a Yamaha MT10. Like, they have good torque, yes, they do, but it's not this. It's not. It's just not the same. Anyway, now that we are up to cruising speed here, 70-something miles, oh, I'm in 5th gear. So yeah, and that's actually a good segue. I was just going to talk about how I think the gearing is so pleasant and nice on this bike. I thought that about the 1290 Super Duke as well, and other V-twins too. V-twin Multistradas, 1200s and 1260s, as well as V-twin Diavels and that kind of thing. I think that engine dynamic encourages companies to make the top couple of gears really kind of feel like overdrives, you know, where they're just sort of the bike's loping along when they're going this approximate speed. I will note that the 1390 has slightly shorter 5th and 6th gear than the 1290, which I think is a little disappointing because I really appreciated how kind of absurdly tall the upper gears were on the 1290, but this bike is not a huge downgrade. It's not that big a deal. I still think the gearing is pretty much spot on, which if you know anything about Daily Rider, you know that I often complain about companies not doing their utmost to understand, respect, and utilize the dynamism and range of an engine in a motorcycle, but KTM has done that with this bike, and I really appreciate it. One of the reasons that KTM did that is that this bike's not built around something, right? A Tuono is built from an RSV4, and an MT10 to some extent is built from an R1. And bikes take transmission components and other pieces that are already built, and they just use them because it suits the bike. But this bike was not built around any sort of other model or any rule book. And I think that's why it feels so good doing the things that it's best at. I'm not sure what kind of gas mileage we're getting right now at this speed, but I can tell you that overall my gas mileage figures were around 40 miles per gallon. I think the low number I got was 37, the high was 41 or 42, and I'm sure you could do much worse or much better if you really tried. But with a 4.6 gallon tank, you get pretty decent range. I've been filling up at 160, 170 miles, I think. I think that's pretty good. I think fuel range is really dependent on what the bike's purpose is and what it's meant to do. Considering this is a brawny, big, high-performance street fighter situation, then 175 miles or something is totally acceptable. Oh, it's a traffic brake. Turn on my four ways so that I don't get rear-ended by this Mercedes. Are you paying attention? Please don't hit me. Thank you. Well, the fuzz is kind of harsh in the end of our freeway review here, but that's okay. I was going to talk about mirrors, and I can still do that. I can tell you that they're pretty smooth, and I think it's in part because of that nice tall gearing, because at maybe 5,000, 5,500 RPM, like if you had to rev it that high to go freeway speeds, the mirrors do get kind of blurry. But in a certain RPM, around 4 grand, 4,500, I think, in top gear, they're fairly smooth and feels intentional. And again, I appreciate it. I also think they're just sort of like a nice shape and not too much bezel. They're kind of simple but useful, and seems like the kind of thing KTM cares about. Add some practicality. I like it. All right, I'm going to cut the engine, and I think we are going to talk about the dash at this point, because I don't know how long this is going to be. Maybe not that long. Looks like we're all done. We'll talk about the dash later. The big takeaway for freeway manners really is that they're pretty darn good. It's a really reasonable bike. Not necessarily more so than a Yamaha MT10 or a Ducati Street Fighter V4, not necessarily, but good in a way that it didn't have to be. And just like those bikes, I appreciate that the company went through the trouble to make it nice. All right, off into the neighborhood and the Round Town Challenge. Oh, it wasn't a Mercedes behind me. It was an Infiniti. Well, good for you, Nissan. So, the stop sign challenge. Let's see how the footless stops go on the old 1390 Super Duke. I was just talking about how docile and civil it is. That is a very, very juicy footless stop, little rollback and everything. Despite how clean that first footless stop was, as I pat myself on the back, I wouldn't say the Super Duke is ultra easy around town. Oh, there's two things that kind of get to me a little bit. One is the hydraulic clutch engagement, which is not, that's another very good one, my goodness. The hydraulic clutch is not a problem. It's well engineered. Hydraulic clutches are fine. I don't have a vendetta against them. But sometimes I feel like you just don't get that kind of really tactile, fine, kind of precise feel that you get with a cable operated clutch. You totally adapt to this clutch, it's fine. It's not even really a standout. I just wanted to call it out because I like an old school cable clutch sometimes. The other thing is the throttle response, which in general, aside from being adjustable in a bunch of different ways, I think street, sport, track, maybe, something like that, it is ride-by-wire. And I have kind of the same complaint about this bike as I do about the 890 SMT we tested earlier this year on Daily Rider, as well as the Harley-Davidson Nightster, which in general have excellent engines and are fun to use and just well-engineered motorcycles in general. But there's a little bit of synthetic feel in the twist of the grip. In the case of the 1390, there's like a little bit of spring tension that you can work against in the throttle before it actually starts opening the throttle bodies, which makes it feel a little disconnected and a little strange. And I only really mention it because this is a $22,000 flagship premium product. And I think that that's slightly unbecoming, but you'll totally get used to it. And in general, the mapping is really nice. It's linear, predictable, and it's adjustable. As we sit at this stoplight here, I can talk about the heat coming off the bike. It is 64 degrees according to the 1390's TFT dash here. And regardless of what the temperature is, it'll be a little warmer for your right foot and your right leg because of all this massive plumbing coming out of the engine right there. I don't think it's horrible. Haven't ridden this bike on a truly hot day, but I don't get the sense that it's bad. It's just, it's notable because it's kind of a hot rod. Other general notes for round town manners and poise. The 1390 is really good. It's balanced. It's not really a heavy or a light bike. It's sort of in the middle of the road, but it's substantial, but it never feels crazy top heavy or super intimidating considering the size of it. It's also just kind of polite in some other ways. Like, for example, the exhaust, which is surprisingly quiet, I feel. I don't say it's a bad thing, but you just get almost like more intake noise sometimes than you get exhaust noise, which is not, I don't think, quite as flattering or as much fun on a big V-twin as it is on like an inline 4, where that kind of howl is fun. Whereas on this bike, it just feels like, I don't know, I don't like it as much. But as far as, you know, riding around town, you're probably not going to tick off any neighbors with this pipe, which is a nice feature, in my opinion. Okie dokie. Passenger test time on Lover's Lane. We can turn on cruise control. We can hit set, and we can set it at 30, what are we gonna do? 32 miles an hour. I think there's a lower limit. What is it? 25 miles an hour is the lower limit of the cruise control, just so you know. And yeah, we can pop back onto the passenger seat just for a moment here. And I can tell you that it is just sort of like a 2/3 size version of the rider seat, which is flat, but surprisingly cushy and not that bad considering what the bike is. There's also more legroom than I was expecting. I would give it better marks than a typical Sport Naked, maybe aside from the MT10, though I don't remember MT10. No, I think the MT10 might have pretty high passenger pegs, actually. Anyway, I think it's decent. I don't think you're going to do a lot of two-up touring on this bike, if I had to guess. But again, just another one of those things about the Super Duke that's kind of like nicer than it needs to be, I think. Up into the hills here, and we're getting almost precipitation. Apologies if your view is obscured by this strange substance coming from the sky in Los Angeles here. Right, as we dip into a misty, cool, twisty road section. I've got basically nothing but good things to say about how this bike goes through corners. It's nice and balanced. It feels really agile without feeling kind of twitchy. It's really, really good. On a twisty road, the engine dynamic is great for this kind of riding. You can just sort of fire out of tight corners, and if you're on a more open road, it's just going to kind of chug along and feel really at home, I think, in just about every circumstance. When I took the 1390 to a track day, I had more of those good feelings in general. I think that it gives up still after all these years, and after all of the talk of focus on track performance from KTM, it still does give up a little bit of that final kind of sharp edge on a racetrack too, in a Aprilia Tuono, a BMW S1000 single R, because those bikes are based on super bikes and this one isn't. And I think that the KTM Super Duke benefits a lot from not being based on a super bike for street use and general use and daily use. It misses a little bit on the racetrack from not having that superbike DNA. And I think it's a compromise that's totally fine, because if you do fly around a racetrack on this bike, you're gonna find that it's plenty. There's plenty of power, and because the componentry is so good, there's plenty of adjustability in the suspension and the electronics. There's plenty of power in the brakes. You're not going to be let down by anything. Only really kind of experienced and high-level riders are going to find just a little bit of maybe like lacking that killer instinct, that final, 2%, 5% on the racetrack. But in general, bikes are just so flippin' capable these days. It's just, you don't even really need that, if we're being honest. Right, we're headed for this red light. We can talk about those brakes. Give them a good stab here. Make sure no one's behind me. Just stands on its nose. 2-finger pull. It's exactly what a 190 horsepower, $22,000 motorcycle should feel like when you pull on the brake lever. It should go bam and just stop when you're ready. And that it does. All right, well, because we've got a little head start on this traffic and our little urban jumps coming up here, let's see how the off-road DNA mixed in with the Super Duke here with our little route jump. That's pretty good air. And I suppose a good segue into talking about I am in comfort suspension mode, and that really backs off the compression, rebound, damping controls in the fork and shock, and it makes it fairly cushy. Of course, it doesn't change the spring rate because you can't really do that to any great extent electronically, but it does back out those parameters in the compression and rebound and make it, I wouldn't say cushy, but definitely loose in a way that's good, welcome, especially if you're gonna hit, you know, jumps like that. So, this engine, I talked in the beginning about that neat trick that the 1290 always did. It was so vicious and raucous, but also could just sort of feel like a pleasant little mid-sized V-twin if you wanted it to. And does the 1390 do the same? I think it does. I think sometimes the sequel is not as impactful as the original movie because you're already in the universe and you already understand the capabilities of the characters at this point. And that's kind of how the 1390 feels to me. I'm not as surprised, there's not as much shock and awe, but it still delivers that nice sort of gentle feeling. I'm always kind of like baffled a little bit and yeah, in a little bit of awe that it can feel so gentle and pleasant. If you just want to putt around, if you just want an SV650, then just like don't open the throttle and you'll get a pleasant, easy bike to ride. And if you want to bend space and time, then you can open the throttle and let the wheelie control do its work. I was talking about engine heat and the cooling fan's on now, but unlike some bikes which show you the actual temperature of the cooling system and can make you worry if you know what the numbers mean, the Super Duke just has a little thing in the middle here that says okay. Coolant temperature is okay. So overall, as we wind down the ride here, did KTM blend Super and Duke appropriately, as I said earlier? Is it a good successor to the 1290 Super Duke? I think it is. I think it is. I personally don't think that it needed to become more powerful. I don't think it needed to become more complex. I think that some of the updates to the chassis, the slightly sort of taller and a little bit sportier, more aggressive riding position, has helped it feel more appropriate as a super naked, hyper naked, whatever you want to call it. I don't think it needed the complexity. I think that's a difficult balance for bikes like these to feel raw and simple and visceral, but also they're flagships, right? These are the sort of like some of the biggest, baddest bikes that the companies produce, especially KTM, which does not currently in 2024 anyway have you know, a super bike or a sport bike really, especially in this category. So yeah, it's a tough thing to blend, and I don't blame KTM for making this thing fully high-tech and fully modern. Luckily, the Super Duke's foundation is really, really nice. It's just really well built. It's a little bit over-engineered. It's sort of more than you need in almost every category of power and brakes and chassis and comfort. It's really good at its core. And so all the stuff that's sprinkled on later is gravy, but not necessary to experience the bike for what it is. So even though we already experienced what it's like to jump on Super Duke, now we can play around with some of the traction control and see what it's like to go down a dirt road. To dive into the dash a little bit here, tap right on this keypad, go to the menu. In the ride mode section here, you have a whole bunch of different rain, street, sport, track, performance. Performance is basically a street mode that does not change the dash from street mode to track mode, but it does allow you to adjust individual parameters. So if I go back to the main screen here, you can see I can adjust ABS, I can adjust the traction control. I'm in level 3 here, and with these little paddles over on the left side, I can add or minus with my index finger the settings. So you see 3, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then you can adjust preload settings in the shock to raise or lower the seat height. Practically, you can adjust the damping to be comfort, sport, track, a whole bunch of stuff. Let's see what else. I mean, you can adjust, yeah, throttle response individually, track, street, or sport. I like street. I think it works the best in my opinion. Adjustable engine braking, different levels of anti-wheelie, low, very low, medium, high, very high. I have it off for what I hope are obvious reasons. Factory start option, which squats the rear of the bike and allows you to launch super fast. Bit of a gimmick, but kind of neat, I suppose. Launch control, which controls RPM when you're doing that start there. ABS mode, which I have in super motard, which is kind of neat. And then traction control and quick shifter adjustment, that kind of thing. It is extremely deep menu system, and because of that, there's this little custom toggle thingy over here. So if you pull back on this, it'll take you directly to the damping, which I have set to do damping. You can set it to do whatever you want. And if you flick it forward, it will go to, what will it go to? Oh, is it not set for anything? I thought I had it set for traction control. Anyway, there's a custom switch, which is kind of neat. Okay, we've been idling here long enough. Let's experiment with some traction control. I have it in 5 here, but I can set traction control up to slip adjustment, up to 9, the maximum level, and then we'll give that a try, shall we? Let's see how it does. Oh wow, you can just like open the throttle, see that? It sort of lets you accelerate, but it like spins initially and goes, and then reins it in. Let's try 1, see what that's like. It's definitely a little bit more aggressive. And then I think if we hold it down, even while we're rolling, close the throttle release button, we are off, traction control off. And that is pretty foolish. You could, you could really hurt yourself. You could really hurt yourself doing that. All right, I'm gonna turn it back on. Turn it on again, there we go, yeah. I like having traction control on, especially when you can have wheelie control off. Why wheelie control off, Zach? Well, let's just experiment with that real quick, shall we? Let's go second gear, 2,500 RPM. Good. I mean, the wheelies you can do on this bike. This bike will do power wheelies by accident in 3rd and 4th gear. It's phenomenally powerful. It's an incredibly good wheelie bike. Just like the 1290 before it. It is, I think, maybe safe to say it's the wheelie king. I don't know if there's another bike I feel like I could do a longer or more ridiculous or satisfying wheelie on than this bike. One last sprint to work. We're almost there. As for can you back it in, abso-flippin'-lutely you can back it in. So much all day. And you can have wheelie control off. You can have wheelie control off. You can have traction control on, and you can have rear ABS off. And you can... Oh, it's so good. It's absolutely all the adjustability that you should have on a bike like this. It's dynamite. All right, yet again, parking is packed for the U-turn challenge, so we'll line up along this line here. Go full lock left, feet up. Just within 2, I think. Maybe just within 2, maybe 2.1 parking spaces. The standard's high in my mind for a bike like this. It should be good at doing U-turns. It should be usable. That's, yeah, one of the things that a big naked bike should be able to do. Oh, the side stand's down, you guys. Side stand is down. Just so everyone knows. All right. Let's listen to that surprisingly quiet, surprisingly ferocious engine. Just, it's got a menacing tone, does it not? It might be quiet-ish, but when it barks, you get the feeling it knows how to bite. Okie doke. Instagram question time. And the first couple are from people I know. I don't normally do this, but my actual friends had actual good questions this time around. The first one is from someone called Spurge Dunbar. I don't know if anyone here's ever heard of him. A friend of mine, though, in case you're not familiar. He is all about suspension. And so he asked, does this need the shameless plug manual suspension upgrade from his friends at Solid Performance? Or are you happy with the active suspension settings? In other words, the electronic gizmo mumbo jumbo. And then he says, same question, but now you're on a racetrack. This is a good question, and something that I think any astute buyer of a 1390 should be asking. Like, do I want that stuff? Is it the best that it can be? Or am I going to wish that I just had something simpler down the road? To answer the question, I think the semi-active suspension and electronic adjustability is great on this bike. I think it's good. I like the ability to go from comfort to sport and have the bike sort of tighten up if you're on a really tight road, or, when you go to the racetrack, you can adjust it totally manually, like I said. That's a nice feature in this day and age for a premium product to have. And I didn't find that it was, on street tires anyway, at the racetrack, I didn't find that it was any different at the racetrack. I appreciated having that adjustability. I appreciated not having to get a wrench out to decide how much I wanted to change damping settings or something like that. So yeah, for I think 98%, 99% of people, it's going to be exactly what you want. For those suspension connoisseurs, such as my friend Spurge here, you can get upgraded WP fork and shock that I believe are not electronically adjustable, but rather just have nicer, higher end componentry inside. And I think it's like $2,300 for the shock and $2,200 for the fork or something like that. Super high spec stuff, if that's really what you want. But I think that this is pretty good. I'd stick with it if I were you. Spurge. Next question is from my buddy Jackson Photo. This is a fun one. He said, if the 790 Duke was billed as the scalpel, what sort of cutting tool would the 1390 be? Is it a steak knife, a scythe, a chainsaw? Great question, and I would like to call this out. There are a bunch of answers on my Instagram feed from people who chimed in what they think the cutting tool analogy would be, and I'm not sure which one to agree with. Someone said bazooka, someone said machete. It's pretty forceful, this cutting tool. It uses force to get a lot done. Not that it's not precise, not that it's not refined, but yeah, maybe machete. I think if the 790 or 890 is a scalpel, this is a machete. It's still sharp, but man, now it's heavy. Next question is from Camilo Botero Carrizosa. I'm sure I'm not saying that right. I am sorry. But anyway, he had a good question, which is this the most fun bike ever? Or do you think a Street Fighter V4 or M1000 Single R is better / has a better giggle factor? So I had other questions from people bringing up the analogy I made with the last KTM I covered here, which was about Austria being between Italy and Germany and kind of being like, not as flamboyant as Italians make their motorcycles, but not as sort of like pragmatic or stoic and kind of clinical as Germans often make their motorcycles. And I wanted to circle back. I think this is a good question about the Street Fighter V4 and the M1000 Single R, because in my mind, actually, I think the Street Fighter V4 is kind of the Austrian of the group, and I think the 1390 is more the Italian of the group, even though that doesn't match the nationality. The Street Fighter V4 is pretty serious, I think, especially for an Italian bike. It's pretty to the point. It's surprisingly comfortable and kind of easy to use, even though it has this outward aura of being kind of like belching fire. It's very potent and impressive, but also just kind of serious. And the 1390, I think, is a little bit more playful. It's almost like the spiritual successor, as someone said, I think, in my Instagram feed, to big V twins that Ducati used to make. In some ways, this is the evolution of that. Since Ducati flagships are now V4s, this bike feels like it's kind of holding that torch now of being really the flamboyant, wild, ridiculous big V twin. So I think that's an interesting kind of flip-flop and maybe backpedal of my analogy from before. Anyway, great question and interesting things to consider. Okay, last question here. Another sort of comparison, which I think are very fun. I would like to call out that someone said, which 20th or 21st century dictator does this bike most represent? And I want you to know, if you ask that question, I just feel like comparing a motorcycle to a dictator is a slippery slope of politics. And, most dictators are kind of a-holes, and I don't really want to associate. So I didn't go down that road, but it was a great question, and I very much appreciate it. Instead, we're going to answer the question from Justin. We have a situation, which goes something like this. Which famous Austrian person from history does it resemble? Another great question. I'm going with maybe the obvious one, but I mean, come on. How could this not be Arnold Schwarzenegger? How could it not be? It's burly, it's ridiculous, it's complex, and it's a bit polarizing. Some people, especially when Arnold was in office there, you got people who didn't agree with his politics or some of the decisions he was making. The point is, it is immensely strong. It is complicated, modern, and polarizing. It is the Arnold Schwarzenegger of motorcycles. I stand by that, and I think it's a great question. Thank you again. A lot of awesome questions this time around. I really appreciate all of the feedback and all of the help making Daily Rider episodes fun. Stick with me a little bit longer. We're going to throw the sucker on the Daily Rider leaderboard. Here we are. Thanks for sticking with me. Inside RevZilla West and the Daily Rider leaderboard, we have a KTM 1390 Super Duke ready to go on the board. The podium as it stands: 890 SMT from KTM, Moto Guzzi V100 Mandello, BMW M1000 Single R. You can see the Super Duke gets a is both spicy and pricey, as we say here, because it's the better part of $22,000 and has 190 horsepower. I only bring that up because I was actually glancing at the other boards here, looking at other bikes that are both spicy and pricey. Diavol V4 from Ducati, CBR 1000 RRR SP, BMW S1000 RR, Ducati Street Fighter V4, Triumph Rocket 3R, spicy and pricey. The reason I'm calling this out is that bikes that are very fast and very expensive aren't necessarily good daily riders. The KTM 1390 is. It is very fast, it is very expensive, and it is a good daily rider. The first bike I want to talk about is the Kawasaki Z900 SE. Whenever I bring it up, I think I say something like, it's really good. It's like a little bit vanilla maybe, a little bit forgettable, but really good. Like good brakes, good engine, good comfort, good chassis, good electronic, it's good bike. The KTM 1390 Super Duke is sort of the Z900 SE accelerated. It's just more of everything. It has sharper handling, it has more powerful brakes, it has more horsepower, it has more electronics, it has more capability, it has more pizzazz, it has more kickstand presence. Point being, the 1390 is going to be up here somewhere. The next bike it seems like it makes sense to discuss would be BMW's M1000 Single R. Very, very capable bike. I brought this bike up tangentially anyway a couple times during the ride to say that, for example, the KTM doesn't quite have the scalpel-like precision on a racetrack as the M1000 Single R, and that is true. As a daily rider though, I feel like the KTM kind of does everything the 1000 Single R does, but a little bit better. The power's in a more usable place because of the engine configuration. Does it sound as kind of like demonic and ridiculous when you rev it up? And does it have all the carbon fiber bits straight from the factory and all the like billet pieces and adjustable gizmos? No, it doesn't. But I do think as a daily rider, it has a slight edge. Moto Guzzi V100 Mandello is an interesting bike to compare to a KTM 1390 Super Duke because the V100 Mandello was flawed, as the 1390 Super Duke is in some ways, but just had that incredible engine, such a good engine, such a engaging and an interesting piece of equipment to ride. And also, you know, adjustable windscreen. The V100 Mandello in some ways is like a little bit more practical and pragmatic than the KTM 1390. Is the 1390 Super Duke better than an 890 SMT? It's sort of little cousin or sibling there. In some ways it is, but I just think the 890 SMT makes too much sense. I know it's not as powerful, I know it's not as flashy, I know it's not as like, but I think it makes more sense. I do. So I'm gonna give the nod to that. The question is, where does it finish here? Above the, so V100 Mandello and a 1390 Super Duke are sitting next to each other and I have to ride somewhere. I'm gonna go with the Super Duke. And before you haters crack your knuckles and leave your comments about like, oh, he doesn't ride any KTMs for a while and then the top two on the leaderboard is for sale. How much did they pay you, man? Shut up. These are great motorcycles, period. Absolutely stand by that. Also, I'm looking at a BMW R1300 GS on the other side of the garage and something tells me the top of the leaderboard is going to be disrupted sometime soon. So, to bring it back around, the KTM 1390 Super Duke is pretty high up on the leaderboard and it is lightning in a bottle. It's just as special and adrenaline provoking as it's always been. I don't think it needed to get so much more expensive than it was. I don't think it needed to get so much more complicated. But again, I can't blame KTM for doing that. And it is still just an amazing motorcycle to ride. I think by now I've written an article about the KTM 1390 Super Duke, and you can go to RevZilla.com/common to find that article. It might even be a link in the description of this video where I'll talk more about some of the specifics of the suspension, the adjustment, the fact that it has 37,000 mile valve intervals, stuff like that. In the meantime, thanks so much for hanging out. Appreciate it. Ride safe. See everybody. Those little quiet power wheelies are one of my favorite things about this bike. Not even going fast. It's just like, yep, lift the front wheel up. Don't have to make a meal of it. You don't have to go in a zillion miles an hour. It doesn't make a lot of noise. It just delivers you a little bit of fun. It's like a little finger sandwich of fun. Here, have a snack. But as you take off, little yip, just picks the front wheel up like a like a weightlifter picking up a child or something. Just, it's like a kitten batting a balloon or something. Just pop, front wheel in the air. How did that happen? Oh my God.